The first time I realized the footage didn't belong to the moment it was recording, I was scrubbing back through a clip that I had just watched live less than a minute earlier. And somehow there was already something new in it that I knew hadn't been there before. Not something obvious, not a figure or a movement, just a small change in the way the reflection in a glass door shifted slightly out of sync with the person walking past it, like it hesitated for a fraction of a second before following. And at first I assumed it was compression or lag or something technical that I didn't fully understand, because when you work with security cameras long enough, you get used to imperfections, small distortions that don't mean anything. But this felt different, not because it was dramatic, but because it was consistent. Because every time I replayed that same moment, the delay was still there, exactly the same, as if it had been recorded that way intentionally. And I remember pausing the footage and leaning closer to the screen, trying to line up the movement frame by frame. And the more I focused on it, the clearer it became that the reflection wasn't just delayed, it was doing something slightly different, something that didn't match the person it was supposed to mirror. And that's when the thought first crossed my mind that maybe the camera wasn't capturing reality as it happened, but something adjacent to it, something that followed similar patterns but didn't align perfectly. And I pushed that thought away almost immediately because it sounded unreasonable even in my own head, but it stayed there quietly in the background as I continued my shift, checking feeds, logging incidents, doing everything I was supposed to do, except now I was watching the cameras differently, not just for obvious issues, but for small inconsistencies, things that didn't quite match up. And once you start looking for that kind of thing, it becomes harder to ignore, like noticing a pattern in static that you can't unsee once it forms. And over the next few nights, I started to find more of those moments, subtle shifts in timing, reflections that didn't line up, shadows that moved slightly before the objects casting them. Always small, always easy to dismiss on their own. But together they formed something that felt deliberate, like a set of rules that the footage was following. And the first clear rule I recognized was that the camera never showed the change as it happened, only before or after, never during, which meant that whatever was different in the footage existed outside the exact moment of recording, like it was being inserted or adjusted in the gaps between frames. And I tested it by watching certain clips live and then immediately replaying them, looking for differences. And more often than not, there would be something, a detail that hadn't been there before. And what made it more unsettling was that those changes never contradicted what I'd seen. They built on it, like they were extending the moment rather than replacing it. And that's when I started to feel like I wasn't just observing the footage anymore. I was interacting with it in some way, like my act of watching, of reviewing, was part of the process that allowed those changes to exist. And that thought stayed with me until the night I saw something that couldn't be explained as a simple delay or distortion, something that changed my understanding of what the cameras were actually capturing. Because I was watching a feed from a storage corridor, completely empty, no movement, nothing unusual. And I switched to another camera for a few seconds before coming back to it. And when I did, there was a door at the end of the corridor that was slightly open, and I know for a fact it had been closed before because I checked it earlier in the night, both physically and on the camera. And I remember staring at the screen, trying to recall if I had missed something, if I had looked away at the wrong moment. But even if I had, the door couldn't have opened that quickly without making a sound, without showing some sign of movement on the feed, and I rewound the footage, going back to the moment I had switched cameras, and there it was, the door closed, exactly as I remembered, and then I stepped forward, frame by frame, expecting to see it move, but it didn't. It just appeared open in the next segment, no transition, no motion, just a state change that had no visible cause. And that was the moment I realized the second rule, which was that the cameras didn't capture transitions, only states. Like they skipped over the part where things actually changed. And that realization made every feed feel less reliable, less grounded, because it meant I could never be sure what had happened between the moments I was seeing. And I started to feel like there were entire sequences of events occurring in those unseen gaps, things that the cameras were deliberately not showing. And that idea became harder to ignore when I noticed that certain areas seemed to change more frequently than others, like the storage corridor, the parking garage, the back stairwell, places where there were fewer people, fewer interruptions. And I began to focus on those feeds more, watching them longer, trying to catch something in those gaps, something that would explain what was happening. And for a while, nothing obvious appeared, just the same subtle inconsistencies, the same pattern of before and after without during, until the night I saw something in the reflection again. Not a delay this time, but a presence. Something that wasn't in the actual space, but appeared clearly in the reflective surface of a window standing just out of frame. And I froze when I saw it, not because it was clear or detailed, but because it was consistent across multiple frames. Not shifting, not fading, just there. And I checked the corresponding camera angle immediately, expecting to see something in that position. But there was nothing, just empty space. And when I went back to the original feed, the reflection was still there, unchanged. And I realized then that whatever the cameras were capturing wasn't limited to the physical layout of the building, that there were elements in the footage that existed independently of the space itself. And that thought settled into me in a way that made everything else feel different. Like I had been looking at these feeds as representations of reality when they were actually something else entirely, something layered on top of it, following its own set of rules. And I started to notice that those reflective anomalies only appeared after I had already watched a feed once, never the first time, always on replay, and that became the third rule, that the footage revealed more information the second time you saw it, like it was responding to your attention, giving you something new once you had already committed to observing it. And I tested that too, watching certain clips repeatedly, noting the differences. And each time there would be something new, something small but distinct, a shadow where there hadn't been one, a reflection that lingered longer than it should, and I began to feel like I was uncovering something piece by piece, something that wasn't meant to be seen all at once, but revealed gradually through repeated viewing. And that process became almost routine for me, something I did every night without thinking too much about it, until I reached the point where the differences started to include things that directly involved me, and that's when it stopped feeling like observation and started feeling like participation. Because I was reviewing footage from the main office, the room I was sitting in, and in the reflection of the monitor, I could see myself exactly as I was, sitting at the desk. Except there was a moment where the reflection didn't match my movement, where it turned slightly before I did, just a fraction of a second, and I paused the footage immediately, looking at the screen, then at my own reflection in the dark glass of the monitor, trying to align them, and for a moment everything matched perfectly. But then I noticed something else, something I hadn't seen at first, which was that the reflected version of me was looking slightly off to the side, not directly at the monitor the way I was, but past it, as if it was focused on something else in the room, something behind me. And I didn't turn around right away. I just sat there, watching the footage, trying to convince myself it was a glitch, a misalignment, something technical. But the longer I looked at it, the harder it became to dismiss, because it was consistent frame after frame, that slight difference in focus. And eventually I did turn, slowly, carefully, scanning the room behind me, but there was nothing there, just the same empty office, the same arrangement of desks and chairs, and when I turned back to the screen, the reflection had changed again, now matching my position exactly, as if it had corrected itself once I acknowledged it. And that was the moment I understood the fourth rule, which was that the footage only diverged from reality when it wasn't being directly compared to it. Like, it could exist in that altered state only as long as I didn't verify it in real time. And that realization made it feel like a kind of game, not in a playful sense, but in the way something structured and intentional might operate, with rules that defined what could and couldn't be observed. And I started to wonder how far those rules extended, what would happen if I continued to follow them, to observe the footage without interrupting it, without trying to confirm it against reality. And that thought led me to do something I hadn't done before, which was to leave the footage running overnight without checking it, without reviewing it, just letting it record. And when I came back the next night, I went straight to that footage, skipping through it quickly at first, and nothing seemed out of the ordinary, just empty rooms, quiet hallways, the usual stillness of the building after hours. But then I slowed down, watching more carefully, and that's when I saw it. Not in a reflection this time, but directly in the frame. A figure standing at the far end of the storage corridor, completely still. And I paused the footage immediately, my first instinct being that someone had entered the building without my knowledge. But when I checked the logs, there was no record of entry, no alarm triggered, nothing to indicate that anyone had been there. And I went back to the footage, stepping through it, frame by frame, and the figure remained there for several minutes, without moving, without changing, just a fixed presence in a space that had been empty before. And then, without any visible transition, it was gone, just like the door had been, just like everything else. And I realized then that the fifth rule was the simplest and the most unsettling, which was that the footage didn't show everything that happened, only what it allowed you to see, and that whatever existed in those unseen gaps could appear and disappear without ever being captured in motion. And that realization has stayed with me ever since, because even now, in a different job, in a different place, whenever I see a camera feed, I can't help but wonder what isn't being shown, what exists just outside those frames, in those moments between. And sometimes when I look at a reflection in a screen or a window, I catch something that doesn't quite match my movement, just for a second, just long enough to notice. And I've learned not to look too closely, not to replay it, because I can't shake the feeling that the more you watch, the more it gives you. and eventually it might show you something that doesn't stop being there when you look